Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our systematic journey through the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure, the MPE.
Yep, section by section, chapter by chapter,
Mm.
trying to make this, well, massive document a bit more accessible for understanding U.S. patent law.
Exactly. And today we're still in chapter 1800. That's the big one covering the Patent Cooperation Treaty, the PCT.
Right, the PCT, that international framework for filing patents in multiple countries through one application, it's pretty foundational.
It really is. And today's specific focus is MPP Section 1872. The title is Availability of the International Application File for International Preliminary Examination by the Examining Corps.
Sounds a little dry, maybe.
A little, yeah, but, stick with us.
Okay.
Because this bit of procedural detail, it actually shows something really important about how the USPTO works internally.
It does. It impacts how your international application moves through the system.
So our mission today is basically to unpack what this section means for handling that application file, especially after a demand for international preliminary examination is made.
And specifically, what happens when the USPTO was already involved earlier, right, like during the search phase?
Okay, got it. So picture this. An applicant has a PCT application, and they've decided, okay, I want an international preliminary examination.
Which is optional, remember. It gives you a non-binding opinion on patentability before you go into the national stage in different countries.
Right. And MPP Section 1872, it zooms in on one particular setup.
Yeah, the situation where the authority doing the preliminary examination, the IPEA, is the same office that did the initial search, the ISA.
And that happens a lot, doesn't it? Especially with the USPTO. Applicants often pick the USPTO for both the search and the preliminary exam.
Very common, particularly for U.S.-based applicants, yeah.
Yeah.
And the core rule here, it comes straight from the PCT Administrative Instructions, Section 605, which MPP Section 1872 points to.
Okay, what's the rule?
It's pretty straightforward, actually. It says when the ISA and the IPA are the same office like the USPTO doing both jobs, then the very same application file used for the search gets used for the preliminary examination, too.
The same file rule? I mean, that sounds logical. Why wouldn't you use the same file? Seems obvious.
It does seem obvious, yeah.
Oh.
But writing it down formally like this ensures everyone's on the same page. Consistency, predictability.
Right.
And the MPP section, drawing on those instructions, points out the big benefit. It streamlines things massively.
How so?
Well, it means the examiner doing the preliminary examination automatically gets everything from the search phase, full access right away.
So they're not starting cold. They see the original application, the search report, all the prior art the first examiner found, maybe even amendments the applicant filed. It's all just there.
It's exactly the idea. It's all consolidated. Think about the alternative for a second.
Okay.
If the IPEA examiner had to, rebuild the file from scratch, track down the search report, find copies of all the citing documents, figure out if amendments were filed.
Ugh. Sounds like a nightmare. Lots of room for delay and things getting missed.
Precisely. Documents could go missing. The file might be incomplete. This same file rule just cuts right through all that potential mess.
So it prevents the process getting sort of bogged down in just paperwork and internal handoffs.
Yeah, it maintains continuity.
Uh-huh.
It ensures the examiner looking at patentability for the preliminary opinion has the whole story, the whole history within that international phase readily available.
Okay, so let's pull back the curtain a bit on the USPTO's internal process here based on this MPP section. How does this actually work on the ground? What happens once that demand for preliminary examination lands?
Right. So the applicant submits their complete demand. That means the right forms. They've picked the USPTO as the IPEA, and crucially, they've paid the fees.
The fees, always the fees.
Yeah, so first up is the PCT International Application Processing Division at the USPTO. They do the admin check.
Making sure all the I's are dotted and
Yeah.
crossed on the demand itself.
Exactly. Is the demand proper? Are the fees paid? They handle that initial administrative lift. Once they confirm, everything's good to go.
Then it goes off to an examiner.
Correct. The application with that processed demand, now part of its record, gets assigned, usually to an examiner in the technology center that handles that specific field of invention.
Okay, and this is where the same file thing really matters, isn't it? It's about which file goes to that examiner.
That's the crux of it, yeah. MPP Section 1872 highlights this. If the USPTO was the ISA for this application earlier.
Meaning a USPTO examiner did the initial search.
Right. Then the internal workflow is set up so that the exact same file, the one built during the search, is routed to the examiner doing the preliminary examination.
Huh. So not just copies of key documents, but literally the working file from the search phase. Maybe even with internal notes or something.
Well, the same application file implies the whole record developed during search. So, yeah, the original application, any Article 19 amendments the applicant might have made after the search,
Uh-huh.
the International Search Report itself, the written opinion from the ISA, and all the prior art documents that were cited. It should all be in there.
Wow, okay. That seems incredibly useful for the second examiner, the preliminary examiner.
Absolutely.
They can see the whole context, not just what the search found, but maybe why the applicant amended claims and what the search examiner's initial take was in that written opinion.
Exactly. It lets the preliminary examiner basically pick up the thread from where the search examiner left off. They can build on that previous work.
Right.
Now, they aren't strictly bound by the search examiner's opinion. The preliminary examination results in its own non-binding opinion, but having that full context just makes their job, well, more informed.
Okay, let's use that example from the source material to make it really concrete. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. So imagine you're an inventor using the PCT. You file your application maybe directly with the USPTO as your receiving office, and you designate the USPTO to be your International Searching Authority, your ISA.
Pretty standard move for many U.S. folks.
Right. So a USPTO examiner does the search, issues the search report in the written opinion. That phase is done. The file now contains all that info. Then later on, you decide, yeah, I want that optional preliminary examination. You file the demand, and again, you choose the USPTO to be the International Preliminary Examining Authority, the IPEA.
So USPTO is wearing both hats now, ISA and IPEA.
Exactly. So MPP Section 1872 tells us what happens next. When your demand is processed and the case gets assigned to a preliminary examiner in the right tech center, what file do they receive?
They get the same file, the one the search examiner used.
Bingo.
Right.
The physical, or more likely now, the digital file that was used for the search is the one that appears on the preliminary examiner's dashboard.
So no chasing down documents, no waiting for things from archives, no building a new folder.
Nope. Prior art, search report, opinion, application, amendments, it's all meant to be right there, consolidated.
That really does hammer home the efficiency angle. It's like if you were doing research, you'd just grab the same notebook with all your findings, not start a new one and try to remember everything.
That's a great analogy. It ensures the work just flows, and the second examiner isn't starting at a disadvantage, lacking the full record.
Makes perfect sense. So the benefits highlighted in the MPP and the PCT rule, they really boil down to that efficiency.
That's the biggest one, yeah. Procedural efficiency. It makes the handoff between search and examination smooth when it's all happening within the USPTO.
Right.
It validates the USPTO's role as both II and IPA by having this clear internal process.
And less wasted effort.
Definitely.
Right.
Less duplication of effort, less admin time spent just shuffling paper or files, and ultimately that helps minimize delays in the international phase.
Which can matter down the line for national stage entry deadlines.
Absolutely. Things need to keep moving.
So, stepping back then, why should someone listening, maybe an applicant or an attorney, really care about this specific rule, this MPP Section 1872?
Well, if you're using the PTT, and particularly if you're using the USPTO for both search and preliminary exam, knowing this gives you a bit of insight into the black box, right?
Okay.
You understand how your application file is handled. It gives you predictability.
Yeah.
You know the preliminary examiner isn't starting from zero. They have the full context.
So maybe some confidence that the preliminary examination will be well-grounded in what happened during the search.
Yeah, I think so. Confidence that the examiner has access to the complete history within the PCT system up to that point. It's just one piece of the machinery, but it's a piece designed to make the process work smoothly when the same authority is handling different stages.
It is fascinating how these, seemingly minor procedural rules are actually critical for making the whole system function efficiently, affects the applicant's journey significantly.
It really does. A simple rule about file management, but it underpins a key part of the PCT process, making sure examiners can do their job effectively.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into MPP Section 1872. A good example of how the MPP lays out the practical steps for implementing those broader PCT rules.
And before we finish, we definitely want to give a special thank you to Mike Shepard. He's the creative director who organized this whole audio series, making these explorations possible.
Yes, thank you, Mike. And here's a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe chew on, building on today's discussion.
Consider the ripple effects of this same file rule. How does requiring the reuse of the file when the same office does search and preliminary exam impact the overall speed, maybe the cost and the reliability of that whole international phase.
Yeah, especially compared to a situation where, say, one office does the search and a completely different one does the preliminary exam. Think about how these detailed procedural rules, buried in manuals like the MPE, can actually have pretty big practical consequences for people trying to navigate the global patent landscape.
It's something to think about. And now, the necessary disclaimer. This summary of the MPEP was generated using AI tools, including ChatGPT and NotebookLM, and may contain errors or omissions. It is provided for general educational and informational purposes only.
Right. It's not legal advice, and it's definitely not a substitute for formal instruction. For the official word, always consult the official MPEP, talk to a qualified instructor, or, of course, a registered patent practitioner.